Frank Larkin hated racists, and Frank Larkin was a racist. He would never admit to the second part, though. No, in his mind, he was different. He wasn't like them, the cross-burning, slur-spewing, hood-wearing degenerates he despised. No, Frank considered himself refined, a thinker, a man of standards. His racism was the good kind, he told himself. It was the kind that recognized certain people should stick to their own kind. The kind that believed some cultures are just superior. The kind that nodded approvingly at statistics that confirmed his biases. And yet, his hatred burned hot against the other racists, the skinheads, the open bigots, the ones too stupid to dress their hate in a suit and tie like he did. They embarrassed him. He saw them as crude, low class, an infection that made his own biases look ugly when they were supposed to be logical. Frank Larkin was, in every sense, a hypocrite, and he was perfectly fine with it. One evening, Frank was driving home from a political debate at his favorite bar, where he'd just spent 2 hours ripping apart those low-life supremacists while also casually explaining why hiring too many black people would tank the economy. He felt righteous, justified. The storm outside was fierce, rain hammering his windshield, but he was only a mile from home when he saw the figure on the side of the road. A man, walking, soaked to the bone. Frank wouldn't normally stop for anyone, especially not on a night like this, but something pulled at him, like an unseen force gripping his chest. Against his better judgment, he slowed the car, rolling the window down just enough to shout, "You need a ride?" The man turned, and Frank's stomach dropped. He was Middle Eastern, dark-skinned, long hair, beard, almost looking like one of those people Frank always lumped in with terrorists. For a split second, every instinct in Frank screamed to hit the gas. But the man's eyes, deep, knowing, as if they'd seen every wicked thought Frank had ever had, froze him in place. "I do," the man said. Frank swallowed hard. He didn't want to say yes, but something in him couldn't say no. He unlocked the door. The man climbed in, his wet clothes soaking into the seat. Frank clenched the wheel, eyes forward. "Where you headed?" "Wherever you take me," the man said. His voice was calm, unshaken. They drove in silence for a few miles, the rain easing up. But inside Frank, a storm raged. Something about this man made him uncomfortable, not in the way he usually felt around those people. No, this was deeper, like the man could see him, past his suit-and-tie racism, past the layers of denial, right into the rotted core of who he really was. Frank sneered. "You a Muslim or something?" The man smiled. "Does it matter?" Frank gripped the wheel tighter. "You one of those immigrants coming in, taking jobs?" His own voice sounded hollow. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," the man said. "And so are you." Frank huffed. "Yeah. Well, I ain't got a problem with you people as long as you follow the law." The man chuckled. "You tell yourself that, don't you?" Frank's stomach turned. "Excuse me? You hate the racists because they remind you of yourself." Frank nearly slammed the brakes. "The men in hoods? The ones you rant about. You despise them because they're the mirror you refuse to look into." Frank's chest tightened. "Who the hell do you think you are?" The man turned, looking directly at him. "You already know." And suddenly, Frank did know. His mind fought it, resisted, tried to shove the thought away, but his soul knew. This was no ordinary man. This was no hitchhiker. This was him. Jesus. Not blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus from his childhood church's stained glass windows. Not the European Jesus who always seemed so comfortable. No, this was the real Christ, the one born in a land Frank never wanted to think about, the one who would have been judged by men like him, the one who should have made him furious. And yet, here he was, in his car, staring into his very being. Frank's hands shook. His mouth was dry. "You love your kind, but hate your brother," Jesus said, his voice gentle, yet heavy with a weight that crushed every excuse Frank had ever clung to. "You curse the men who scream their hatred, yet you whisper yours beneath the surface. And you think that makes you righteous." Frank opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out, because there was no argument. The walls he'd built inside himself, brick by brick, excuse by excuse, came crumbling down in an instant. He was no better than the men he condemned. Worse, maybe, because at least they were honest. He had spent his life dressing up his prejudices in logic and civility, pretending it was different when it was all the same poison. Tears burned his eyes. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words scraping his throat like sandpaper. "God, I'm so sorry." Jesus smiled, not in mockery, not in pity, in love. "Then let it go." Frank gasped for air like a drowning man breaking the surface, and just like that, the weight was gone. Not like some cheap miracle, not like flipping a switch, but something shifted. The iron grip of hatred, the lie of superiority, the walls he'd built, they weren't just weakened, they were gone. Frank turned to look at him, to beg, to thank, to do something. But the seat was empty. The car was dry. The storm had passed. Frank Larkin pulled over and wept, not because he had lost something, but because for the first time in his life he had finally won. Frank sat there for what felt like hours, his forehead resting on the steering wheel, his chest heaving with the force of a lifetime's worth of buried truths crashing down on him. The road was silent now, the rain only a mist on the windshield. He thought about every time he had dismissed someone because of their race, every time he had justified his prejudices with clever rhetoric, every time he had hated a man who looked just like Jesus himself. He had spent his whole life believing he was different, better, only to realize he had been just another link in the same chain of hatred he claimed to despise. Finally he straightened up, wiping his face with the sleeve of his jacket. He looked at the empty passenger seat, expecting, hoping to see some sign that what had just happened was real. But there was nothing, no water stain, no footprints, just silence. And yet, in that silence, Frank understood something. This wasn't a dream, and it wasn't just a strange encounter. It was an invitation, a challenge, a command. If he had truly seen Jesus, if he had truly been changed, then it wasn't enough to sit in his car and cry about it. He had to do something. He put the car in drive and turned around, not just on the road, but in his heart, in his life. Frank Larkin had been many things: a racist who hated racists, a man at war with himself, a hypocrite wrapped in self-righteousness. But now, he was something new. He was a man who had seen Jesus and had no choice but to follow him. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of where that road would lead. At first, Frank tried to hide it. The change in his heart felt too raw, too fresh, like a wound that hadn't quite healed. He wasn't ready for people to notice, to question, to challenge him. So he played along. When his friends at the bar went on their usual rants about those people, he nodded silently instead of agreeing outright. When his co-workers griped about diversity hires, he stayed quiet instead of chiming in with his usual statistics. He told himself he was being smart, easing into things, but deep down he knew the truth. He was scared, scared of losing face, scared of their judgment, scared of admitting he had been wrong. But the change was eating at him. He couldn't laugh at the same jokes anymore. They made his stomach turn. He couldn't stomach the casual slurs, the knowing winks, the little microaggressions he used to brush off. Every time he tried to fake it, Jesus' words echoed in his head, "Then let it go." And he knew this wasn't something he could keep in the dark forever. Sooner or later, it would come out. And when it did, there'd be no going back. The moment finally came on a Friday night, when one of his drinking buddies, Ray, started running his mouth about how these immigrants are ruining the country. Normally, Frank would have just sat there, nodding, keeping the peace. But this time, something inside him snapped. He put down his beer, looked Ray dead in the eye, and said, "You ever think maybe we're the problem?" The whole table went silent, eyes narrowed. Someone chuckled nervously, thinking he was joking. But Frank wasn't joking, and for the first time in his life, he didn't care who knew it. The whole table froze. Beer glasses hung in mid-air, half raised to lips that suddenly weren't so thirsty. Someone at the end let out a short, confused laugh, waiting for Frank to smirk, to give the punchline, to let them off the hook. But Frank didn't smirk. He didn't look away. He just sat there, meeting Ray's glare with a steadiness he barely recognized in himself. "The hell does that mean?" Ray asked, his voice low, like a challenge. Frank exhaled slowly. He could feel it coming, that moment of no return. His old self was screaming at him to backpedal, to smooth it over, to crack a joke and move on. But his old self wasn't in control anymore. "It means maybe we've spent our whole damn lives looking for someone to blame," Frank said, his voice measured but firm. "Maybe we've been so busy pointing fingers, we never stopped to ask if we're the ones who need to change." Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Ray's face darkened. "You sound like one of them." Frank had expected the words, but they still hit like a gut punch. One of them. The phrase that had always been a warning, an accusation, a line in the sand. He could feel the eyes on him now, scanning him like he was some kind of traitor, a man who had crossed the line. Maybe the old Frank would have backtracked. Maybe he would have laughed it off, played it safe. But the old Frank was gone. "If them means people who don't sit around blaming every problem on folks who don't look like me," he said, leaning forward, "then yeah, maybe I do." Ray's jaw clenched, his knuckles white around his glass. For a moment Frank thought a punch was coming, but instead Ray just scoffed and shook his head. "You've changed," he muttered. Frank nodded. "Yeah, I have." The tension at the table was unbearable. One by one, the guys turned away, pretending to watch the game on the bar's TV, pretending this wasn't happening. A few minutes later, Ray and another guy made an excuse and left, and the rest of them went back to their drinks, their conversations, carefully avoiding eye contact with Frank. And just like that, he knew his old life was over. He didn't regret it. Driving home that night, he thought about Jesus, about that car ride, about the weight that had lifted from his soul. He thought about the cost of change, the people he'd lose, the friendships that would fray. He thought about how much easier it would be to slip back into his old ways, to just pretend. But easy had never saved anybody. For the first time in his life, Frank Larkin wasn't just tolerating change, he was walking in it. And no matter how many people turned their backs on him, he knew one thing for sure: Jesus never would.